finally not 10,000 degrees in my house. Hi everybody, welcome back to my channel, or thanks for joining us if you're new here. My name is Maddie, and today we're gonna get a little spooky. So I've had this idea for this video kind of like bouncing around in my head for a while. Over the past week I've been like reciting kind of what I want to say. So I figured I should just get to the point where I sit down and film it. But today I kind of want to talk about like monsters, haunting, and trauma, and the way that these things, are linked together. Let's start at the beginning. So last year I took this class called Monsters, Madness, and Malice with one of my favorite professors, and one of the books that we read for that course was Coraline, and I've loved Coraline my whole life. I saw the movie first before reading the books, and I do have to say I'm a little attached to the movies, but because we were doing courses online last year, all of our discussion boards and everything were online, and one of the questions that our professor asked was about, you know, whether this book is too scary for kids, because like obviously that's a big criticism of it. And when I saw the movie in theaters, I was like over the moon loving it, whereas like other people were like taking their kids out of the theater crying. And I have friends who like to this day still refuse to watch it because it scares them. But when I started writing that post, I didn't really know where I was going. But I eventually, you know, Googled when the movie came out, and I realized that that was at the time that a family friend of ours had been diagnosed with a terminal illness, and so I think young me was like wrapping my head around like the realities of death for the first time, on top of the fact that we had a neighbor who was not great and was constantly threatening our family and their well-being. And I think for me as a kid, I needed to see that there were monsters that I could beat, and I think that's what Coraline did for me, and I think that's where like the monster narrative became such a favorite of mine, because it was a way for me to project my fears and my terrors onto something tangible that could be destroyed, especially because a lot of the heavy things that I were dealing with wasn't something that I had control over and wasn't something that I could like make just go away. But I do think that this shifted as I grew up, because I think that the older I got, there was a part of me that started to fall in love with the monster even more and started to become almost like personified by it in a way. I think I really saw pieces of myself in monster characters, and I fell in love with this type of monster that is sympathetic. So I think as I started to identify a little bit more with the monster, as I started to go through my own mental health struggles, I think there's a part of me that wanted to understand what makes a monster monstrous, because I think it's incredibly fascinating that like we as humans create monsters, and we create monsters for a reason. So for example, with Coraline, you know, my prof kind of replied to what I was saying, and he was talking about this way that on some level, maybe subconsciously, children need monsters, and that monsters serve a purpose within like our greater society. And there is this really amazing work that I've cited in probably too many essays, but it is by Jeffrey Jerome Cohen, and it's called Monster Culture, or Seven Theses, and it's all about like the idea of monster culture and like what monsters are and what they represent and like why we've created them. So there's this one line that talks about like the monster's body quite literally incorporates fear, desire, anxiety, and fantasy. And there's a lot of conversations about like the monster as the other. So if we think about Dracula in a lot of writings that people have talked about represents this foreign other, or this fear, and this sense of like the other, something that we can't understand, is a huge thing within monster theory. But on top of that, there's also something of the other that is familiar within ourselves, and it's a fear of that difference that exists within us and wanting to keep it separate from ourselves. There's another great quote from Monster Culture that really explores this, and it's every monster in this way is a double narrative. Two living stories, one that describes how the monster came to be, and another its testimony detailing what cultural use the monster serves. So when we're talking about that othering or that doubling, so there is the history that's built the monster as the other, and then there's the cultural use of why we need to keep that separate, or what the monster represents that we're afraid of. Because oftentimes, you know, monsters are like a mirror. They're a reflection of ourselves and like the own fears that we embody within ourselves. So how does all of this relate to narratives of haunting and trauma. Well, to switch courses here a little bit, another supernatural element that comes up a lot is this idea of haunting or of haunted houses. And I have this quote that I keep on my wall that I absolutely adore. It's from like a Tumblr post, and it's Chatin Guan. I'll probably link it down below so people can find it if they want, but it reads, "What is a haunting but a memory, a trauma? The house saw something terrible, and now every night it plays it out again and again, trying to understand." And I am just obsessed with this idea of haunting as memory and haunting as like a representation of trauma, because I think it makes sense. Like, you know, trauma lives in the floorboards of buildings the same way that trauma weaves itself into our hearts. And there, you know, that quote from the Simon Snow trilogy where Simon says, like, I don't feel like a trauma victim, I feel like a house on fire, someone who died and stayed in his own body. And there's this really physical element to trauma. And by embodying that in a place where the trauma has happened, and having it like replay on a loop, like a traumatic flashback, trying to heal the story, trying to find the gaps in the story that can be repaired, that's what a haunting is. It is trauma, it is an embodiment of the monster come to life. And I just think that's incredible. I think a lot when I talk about that, about the Buffy episode, where there is a teacher and a student who had a relationship, and I think it ended in a like one of them killing the other and then themselves. And so it's the school, the ghosts of these people are embodying other people trying to get their story to end differently. And I think that's so much of what trauma recovery is going back and realizing, you know, it doesn't matter if you could change anything, like what happened happened, and you have to find a way to move forward. And I think that horror narratives in general give us a really safe space to do this. So one of the first Stephen King novels that I ever read was Cujo. And without spoiling it, that book doesn't have the happiest of endings. And that was probably kind of at the height of my depression, but I remember feeling this palpable sense of relief once I got to the end of the book, because it felt so good to finally realize sometimes happily ever after isn't going to work out the way that you want it to. And I felt all these books telling me that somehow I needed to make this darkness in me go away so I could fit the fairy tale norm that it was teaching me. And horror novels taught me that it's okay that things go wrong. It's okay that we're going to lose people, that we're going to be hurt, that we're going to be haunted by these things, that something that happens to us, we're going to carry with us our entire lives, whether that's in like a supernatural, magical way, or it's the scars of what happened, thinking, you know, about Shining and then Doctor Sleep. These things don't just disappear, and horror gave me a safe place to take my depression, take my mental illness, take everything that I was struggling with, and realize that I didn't have to win every battle in order to win, if that makes sense. And that was something that was a massive relief for me, and that was able to help me let go of it. So I think over time, I've really shifted my narratives from feeling like, A, the monster was something that I needed to destroy, to B, the monster was something that could be my savior by helping me understand trauma and history and my own narrative, to C, seeing something of myself in the monster. And I think this is kind of where I am right now, where I love me a good anti-hero. I love me a good story that complicates the monster, that makes it more interesting, that makes it more, I guess, difficult to draw the lines between good and evil. I think that there's a part of me that understands at the core of every monster is a human being. And I think that's something that, much as I hate the relationship trauma I went through and how much it has mangled my sense of self and so much that is going on in my life, I think loving that person who was awful to me helped me understand the dichotomy of the monster a little bit better, and that things are monsters because we make them into monsters, but nothing ever starts as a monster until we name it that way. And I think to me, for the longest time, he was you know, the boy I fell in love with. He was my first love, my best friend, someone I wanted to spend all this time with. And then years later, you know, hearing the word abuse tied to that relationship, someone else was labeling it monster for me. And it's taken me a long time to try and realize how I hold both that like light and dark from that experience in my life together. And I think that's why I'm always very wary of completely writing someone off or completely detailing someone as a monster. There's another really good quote that relates to this that is from Ocean Byung's, I really hope I'm saying his last name right. It's from his book, On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous. It is also on my wall, so I'm going to look up to read it. A monster is not such a terrible thing to be. From the Latin root monstrum, a divine messenger of catastrophe, then adapted by the Old French to mean an animal of myriad origins. Centaur, griffin, satyr. To be a monster is to be a hybrid signal, a lighthouse, both shelter and warning at once. So I think that's really important, that idea of being both shelter and warning at once, is that there is a comfort to the monster. There is a comfort in wanting the world to be so black and white, so good and evil, but understanding that being a monster isn't a bad thing. In fact, I think we all end up being the villains in somebody else's story at some point in our life, but coming to understand the monster as something comfortable and something that we can befriend and be close with, I think is incredibly important. And I think there's so many stories that do such a good job of this that really resonate with me. Right now I'm thinking of Meddling Kids by Edgar Quintero, and the way that it kind of takes that Scooby-Doo narrative and then ties both actual monsters and trauma into that narrative to look at the toll of growing up and the prices that we pay to go through that process. And I just think it's incredible. So I think this is a way my love letter to horror and to monstrosity, because I think there is something beautiful about it, and I'm learning to accept that there are parts of me that will always be a little bit monster, always a little bit fang and claw, and learning to live with it and not hate those parts of me. And I think literature has been a huge part of me being able to make that journey. So I just wanted to share some of my thoughts about it. It might be a little coherent, maybe I'll make a part 2 to this. But yeah, I think that's all I wanted to say about that. And you know, thinking of almost a Where the Wild Things story are, where monsters are freedom in some way, and sometimes they can be unlikely friends where we need them to help us get to the other side of a long, dark night. I love them. I'm a little obsessed with them. If y'all got other thoughts on monstrosity or haunting or trauma that you want to share, feel free to drop me a comment down below. I love reading what you all have to say. So make sure you like this video, give it a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and subscribe and ring that bell so you get notifications. I've also moved from Goodreads to Storygraph, so I will be linking my Storygraph down below now, as well as my Instagram. And I think that's everything. So until the next video, stay kind.